The end of the 11th century was an era of contradictions in Europe. The Christian faith was the center of everyone's life, from the poorest peasant to the most powerful of kings. However, the continent was a violent and fragmented place. Knights and feudal lords constantly warred with each other for pieces of land and power. Violence was a common part of daily life. The Catholic Church, seeking to establish itself as the ultimate authority, saw this internal violence as a serious problem that threatened the stability of Christendom. What was missing was a common enemy, a cause that could unite all those warriors under a single banner. The opportunity for this cause arose thousands of kilometers away, in the Byzantine Empire. The emperor in Constantinople, Alexios I, saw his territory being consumed by the advance of the Seljuk Turks. These warriors, newly converted to Islam, had conquered vast areas of Anatolia, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, and had taken control of Jerusalem. For the Christians of Europe, the news that the city where Christ died was under Muslim rule was disturbing. Reports, often exaggerated, about the persecution of Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land began to circulate, fueling outrage. Desperate, Emperor Alexios sent a message to the West. His request was modest. He asked for a group of mercenary knights to help reconquer his lands. He could not have imagined the avalanche his request would unleash. The message reached the ears of the most powerful man in Europe at the time, Pope Urban II. Urban was an astute politician and an ambitious religious leader. He saw in Alexios's request the solution to several of his problems. He could assert the supremacy of the papacy, divert the violence of European knights toward an external enemy, and perhaps even reunify the Christian churches of the West and East, which had separated decades earlier. In November of 1095, in the city of Clermont, France, Pope Urban gave the speech that would change history. Before a crowd of bishops, nobles, and clergy, he painted a grim picture of the situation in the East. He spoke of the desecration of holy sites and the suffering of Eastern Christians. Then, he made a revolutionary proposal. He called on all Christians, rich and poor, to take up arms and march to the East. Their mission would be to liberate the Holy Land, and to motivate them, he made an extraordinary promise, something never before offered on such a scale. Anyone who participated in this sacred expedition would have all their sins forgiven. It would be an armed pilgrimage, and the final reward would not be earthly, but eternal salvation. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. A single cry echoed across the field, Deus vult. The Latin phrase meant, God wills it. The seed of the Crusades had been planted. The news of the Pope's call spread with astonishing speed, and throughout Europe, a fever of religious fervor and military ambition began to take hold of an entire generation. The response to Pope Urban's call was divided into two distinct waves, with very different fates. The first, known as the People's Crusade, was a disorganized mass of peasants, the poor, and some low-ranking knights, led by charismatic figures like the preacher Peter the Hermit. They were driven by pure religious fervor, without any military or logistical planning. Their journey through Eastern Europe was chaotic. Without supplies, they plundered cities and came into conflict with local populations. Upon arriving in Constantinople, Emperor Alexios, shocked by the group's lack of discipline, quickly had them transported to Anatolia. The result was a massacre. The Turkish forces, experienced and well-equipped, annihilated the popular army almost instantly. The second wave, however, was exactly what the emperor had hoped for. Known as the Prince's Crusade, it was composed of the most powerful and experienced nobles of Europe. Among them were Godfrey of Bouillon, a devout and respected duke, the cunning and ambitious Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman from southern Italy, and the wealthy and influential Raymond of Toulouse. These armies, though acting independently, were professional fighting forces. When they arrived in Constantinople in 1097, Emperor Alexios was impressed, but also wary. He had the Crusader leaders swear an oath of loyalty to him, promising to return to the Byzantine Empire any lands they The first major challenge was the city of Nicaea, the capital of the Sultanate of Rum. After a difficult siege, the city surrendered, but not to the Crusaders. Byzantine agents negotiated a secret surrender, and the European nobles awoke to see the emperor's flag flying on the walls, frustrating their plans to sack the city. This event generated the first major distrust between the Latin and Greek allies. The journey continued south, through the relentless heat of Anatolia, until they reached their greatest obstacle, the giant city of Antioch. The siege of Antioch lasted almost 8 months and tested the limits of the Crusaders. Famine, disease, and constant enemy attacks devastated their ranks. Morale was at its lowest point when a turnaround occurred. Bohemond of Taranto made a secret deal with an Armenian guard inside the city, who betrayed his masters and allowed the Crusaders to enter. The city was taken amidst brutal combat. However, soon after its capture, an even larger Muslim army arrived and besieged the Crusaders inside Antioch. The situation seemed lost, until a monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had a divine vision, revealing the location where the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side on the cross, was buried. The lance was found and, real or not, its discovery worked like a miracle for the army's morale. Energized, the Crusaders marched out of the city and, in a desperate battle, defeated the Muslim force. Ignoring his oath to the Emperor, Bohemond declared himself Prince of Antioch, establishing the First Crusader state. With a reduced army but renewed morale, the remaining Crusaders marched to their final objective. In June of 1099, they finally sighted the walls of Jerusalem. After a 5-week siege and the construction of enormous wooden assault towers, they launched the final attack. On July 15, 1099, the soldiers led by Godfrey of Bouillon were the first to breach the defenses. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in the history of the Crusades. For 2 days, the Christian soldiers carried out an indiscriminate massacre, killing almost the entire Muslim and Jewish population of the city. The chronicles of the time describe streets filled with bodies and blood. The Holy Land was, for the Christians, reconquered. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was established, along with other Crusader states. Godfrey of Bouillon, in an act of piety, refused the title of king, stating that he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He adopted the title of Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. The First Crusade had achieved an almost miraculous military success, but the price in lives and the brutality of its conclusion would leave deep scars on the relationship between Christianity and Islam for centuries. After the conquest of Jerusalem, the Europeans established 4 territories in the east, known as the Crusader states. They were the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa. Essentially, they were feudal outposts, islands of European culture and religion surrounded by a sea of Muslim territories. Life in these kingdoms was precarious, and they depended on a constant flow of pilgrims, supplies, and new soldiers from Europe to survive. To aid in their defense, military orders of warrior monks were created. The 2 most famous were the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, who became the elite troops and the military backbone of the Christian kingdoms. The success of the First Crusade was only possible because the Islamic world was politically fractured. Sunnis and Shias vied for power, and local leaders were more concerned with their internal rivalries than with the foreign threat. However, this situation began to change. The seed of Islamic unification and the counteroffensive, or jihad, was planted when the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, Imad ad-Din Zengi, captured the county of Edessa in 1144. It was the first Crusader state to fall, and the news shocked Europe, leading to the call for the Second Crusade. Led by 2 of the most powerful kings in Europe, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, the campaign was a total failure. Their troops were defeated separately and the expedition failed to reconquer any territory, serving only to boost the confidence of the Muslims. The real turning point came with the rise of one of the most extraordinary leaders of the Middle Ages. His name was an-Nasr Salah ad-Din Yusuf, but the West would know him simply as Saladin, of Kurdish origin. He began his career in the service of Nur ad-Din, Zengi's successor. Saladin was a brilliant military strategist and a charismatic politician. His greatest achievement was taking control of Egypt, ending the Fatimid Caliphate and uniting Egypt and Syria under his command. For the first time since the arrival of the Europeans, the Crusader states were surrounded by a unified Islamic power, led by a single man determined to drive them out. The tension reached a boiling point because of the actions of Reynaud of Chatillon, an impulsive and violent Crusader noble. Disrespecting an established truce, Reynaud attacked a large Muslim caravan, stealing its riches and taking prisoners. For Saladin, this was the final provocation. He swore revenge and summoned the largest army the region had seen in decades. In response, the Christians gathered all their military forces into a single, massive army, led by the King of Jerusalem, Guy of Lus. In July of 1187, Saladin used his tactical genius. He lured the Crusader army away from its water sources, forcing them to march under the scorching desert sun. The heavy armor of the knights turned into an oven. Exhausted and desperate for water, the Christian army was cornered near a hill known as the Horns of Hattin. The Battle of Hattin was an absolute catastrophe for the Crusaders. Their army was completely annihilated. Thousands were killed, and many more, including King Guy himself, were captured. In the battle, Saladin also captured the true cross, the fragment of wood that Christians believed to be from the cross of Christ, their most sacred relic. With the Christian army destroyed, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was defenseless. The cities fell one after another. In October of 1187, less than 3 months after the Battle of Hattin, Saladin arrived at the gates of Jerusalem. 88 years earlier, the First Crusaders had taken the city in a bloodbath. The world expected Saladin to do the same. However, after a brief negotiation, he accepted the city's surrender. In an act that cemented his reputation as a magnanimous and civilized ruler, he forbade any massacre or violence. The Christian citizens were allowed to ransom their own lives and leave in safety. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was purified with rosewater, and Jerusalem was once again under Muslim control. The fall of the Holy City sent a new shockwave throughout Europe, one that would initiate the most famous crusade of all. The news of Jerusalem's fall to Saladin shook Christendom to its core. The papacy's response was immediate, calling for the Third Crusade. This time it would not be just nobles and knights answering the call, but the 3 most powerful monarchs in Europe. The first was Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, a veteran leader who commanded an immense and disciplined army. The second was Philip Augustus, the calculating king of France. And the third was the newly crowned King of England, a man whose legend almost overshadowed his own history. King Richard I, better known as the Lionheart. The expedition began with a tragedy. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who was leading his army by land, drowned while crossing a river in Anatolia. His sudden death caused his army to collapse. Most of his soldiers returned home, and only a small fraction continued the journey. The weight of the crusade now rested on the shoulders of Richard and Philip, two kings who were bitter rivals. They opted for the sea route and arrived in the Holy Land in 1191. The first objective was the strategic port city of Acre, which had been under an exhausting and unsuccessful Christian siege for almost 2 years. The arrival of the French and English armies, with their rested troops and advanced siege equipment, changed the balance of power. The pressure on Acre's defenses became unsustainable, and in July 1191, the Muslim garrison surrendered. It was a crucial victory, but tensions between the Christian leaders exploded soon after. Philip, citing health problems and urgent issues in France, decided to abandon the crusade and return home, leaving Richard as the supreme commander of the Christian forces. Their rivalry was so deep that Richard made Philip swear he would not attack his lands in France while he was away. With total control, Richard made one of his most controversial decisions. Negotiations with Saladin for the exchange of prisoners and the payment of ransom for the Acre garrison had stalled. Impatient and fearing that the Muslim prisoners could become a threat, Richard ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 men, women and children in full view of Saladin's army. It was an act of brutality that stained his reputation and contrasted sharply with Saladin's clemency in Jerusalem. Richard then began his main campaign, to march south along the coast and retake Jerusalem. During the march, his troops were relentlessly harassed by Saladin's cavalry. The decisive confrontation took place near the city of Arsuf. In the Battle of Arsuf, Richard demonstrated his tactical genius. He kept his ranks disciplined under heavy provocation, until the perfect moment to order a devastating cavalry charge that broke Saladin's lines and forced their retreat. It was an important victory that secured control of the coast for the Crusaders and reaffirmed Richard's reputation as one of the greatest warriors of his time. The Crusader army came within a few kilometers of Jerusalem on 2 different occasions. The Holy City was within their reach. However, Richard made the difficult decision not to attack. He was a pragmatic strategist and knew that while he could perhaps conquer the city, he would have no way of holding it. With his supply lines stretched and most of the Crusaders planning to return home after the pilgrimage, the city would be vulnerable to a swift reconquest by Saladin. For Richard, taking Jerusalem only to lose it again would be a humiliating defeat. After months of battles and maneuvers, both sides were exhausted. Richard and Saladin, who had developed a reluctant respect for each other through the conflict, agreed to negotiate peace. The Treaty of Ramla, signed in 1192, ended the Third Crusade. The terms were a compromise. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but the Christians would maintain control of a strip of territory on the coast. The most important point for the Europeans was that unarmed Christian pilgrims would have free and safe access to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem. Shortly after, Richard the Lionheart left the Holy Land, never to return. The Crusade of Kings ended not with a total victory, but with an exhaustive truce between 2 legendary adversaries. In the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful pontiffs in history, called for the Fourth Crusade. The plan was strategic and ambitious. Instead of attacking the Holy Land directly, the Crusaders would sail to Egypt, the heart of Saladin's power, and conquer it. With Egypt under control, the retaking of Jerusalem would be a natural consequence. For the sea crossing, the Crusades' leaders signed a contract with the Republic of Venice, the greatest naval power of the era. The agreement was for the transport of 33,000 soldiers and 4,000 horses. The price was exorbitant. It was here that the plan began to fall apart. A much smaller number of Crusaders arrived in Venice than expected, and they could not raise the money to pay the debt for the fleet. The thousands of soldiers were trapped in Venice, indebted and with no way to proceed. Seeing an opportunity, the Deutsch of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, an elderly, blind, but extremely cunning man, made a proposal. He would defer the rest of the payment if the Crusaders helped him with a small detour to attack and retake the port city of Zara, a Christian city that had rebelled against Venetian rule. Despite some protests, the desperate leaders agreed. In 1202, the Army of the Cross attacked and sacked the Catholic city of Zara. The Pope, furious at this act, excommunicated the entire expedition. While they were in Zara, the Crusaders were approached by Alexios Angelos, a young exiled Byzantine prince. He made them a tempting offer. If the Army of the Cross helped him overthrow the usurper emperor in Constantinople and place him on the throne, he would pay the Crusaders' debt to Venice, finance the conquest of Egypt, provide 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for the crusade, and, most incredibly, submit the Greek Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope in Rome. The promise of wealth and glory was irresistible. The ideals of the Holy War were cast aside, and the crusade changed course, sailing not for Egypt, but for Constantinople. In 1204, what followed was one of the greatest tragedies of the Middle Ages. After a series of battles and political intrigues, the Crusaders, feeling betrayed for not receiving the promised payment, turned their fury against the largest and richest city in Christendom. For 3 days, the army that carried the cross brutally and systematically sacked Constantinople. Monuments were destroyed, libraries burned, and treasures and sacred relics accumulated over 1,000 years were stolen and taken to Europe. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. Instead of fighting the Muslims, it destroyed the Byzantine Empire, the great Christian bastion of the East, leaving a legacy of hatred between the Latin and Greek churches that endures to this day. The Crusades continued throughout the 13th century, but they never again reached the scale or fervor of the first expeditions. There was the Children's Crusade, failed expeditions to Egypt, and even a crusade in which the Holy Roman Emperor briefly recovered Jerusalem through diplomacy. But the impetus had been lost. In 1291, the city of Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, fell to the Mamluks of Egypt. The era of the Crusader states in the East was over. The legacy of these 200 years of conflict is complex and profound. From a negative perspective, the Crusades created a historical wound in the relationship between Christianity and Islam. They solidified the idea of jihad as a defensive war against religious invaders and left a trail of distrust and animosity that was exploited for centuries. The word crusade itself carries a weight of aggression and religious fanaticism to this day. However, for Europe, the consequences were transformative. The constant contact with the East reopened trade routes that brought new spices, fabrics, and technologies. The knowledge of the Islamic world, which had preserved the classical texts of Greek philosophy and science, began to flow into European universities, helping to pave the way for the Renaissance. The need to finance and organize such large armies strengthened the power of kings and weakened the old feudal system. In many ways, the Crusades, despite their long-term military failures, helped to awaken Europe from its dark ages and propel it toward the modern era. In the end, the Crusades were not just a war for religion, they were a manifestation of an expanding Europe, driven by a complex mixture of genuine faith, political ambition, material greed, and a desire for adventure. A saga of faith and fire, whose flames helped to forge the world we live in today. The history of the Crusades is a powerful reminder of how faith and human ambition can intertwine in complex and often destructive ways. Did you already know the bizarre story of the Fourth Crusade? In your opinion, what was the greatest legacy of the Crusades? The religious conflict or the cultural exchange they provoked? What other major historical event would you like to see covered in a documentary like this? Your curiosity is our guide to unraveling the great stories of the world, and the next adventure begins with you.